The billionaire never expected to see his maid that night. He was only passing by the children's room, half awake, half tired, when something strange stopped him. The lights were still on, and through the small opening of the door, he saw her on the floor, her hands on his paralyzed twin sons. At first, he thought she was just checking on them, maybe covering them with a blanket, but then he noticed her movements. Slow, careful, like she was teaching their bodies to live again. Her lips moved in quiet words he couldn't hear. Her palms pressed gently on their weak legs, and her eyes were full of something he hadn't seen in years: hope. For 2 years, those boys had not moved, not spoken, not even smiled. Every doctor in Texas had called it impossible. But right there, inside his own house, the maid he barely noticed was doing something he couldn't explain. And when he saw his son's fingers twitch for the first time, he dropped the file he was holding. The sound echoed through the hallway, but Ruth didn't stop. She kept going, whispering softly as tears rolled down her cheeks. That was the moment Mark Wilson realized his world was about to change forever, because what he was seeing that night was nothing short of a miracle. Mark's feet felt heavy as he stepped inside the room. His voice was stuck in his throat. He stood there, watching Ruth move her hands over the boys' legs, pressing gently, stretching their arms with slow rhythm. It didn't look random. It looked practiced, like she had done it 1,000 times before. Ruth looked up quickly when she noticed him, her hands freezing midair. For a second her face turned pale. Then she lowered her eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to wake you." Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes moved between her and the twins. Ethan's fingers were still moving slightly. Noah's chest lifted with calm, steady breaths. He couldn't understand what he was seeing. "What are you doing?" he finally asked. Her voice came out quiet, almost scared. "They couldn't sleep, sir. I was helping them relax." "Relax?" he repeated, stepping closer. "By moving their arms and legs like that?" "Yes, sir," she said softly. "It helps them feel lighter. Sometimes it helps blood move better." Mark frowned. "Who told you to do that?" "No one, sir." She hesitated for a moment, then said carefully, "I've done this kind of work before. It can help." Her words confused him. She was supposed to be a maid. She wasn't a nurse, not a therapist, not anyone trained to touch his children. "You worked with patients before?" he asked. Ruth looked down again. "A long time ago," she said. Her hands were trembling slightly, but there was no fear in her tone. Only calmness. Mark's eyes drifted back to the boys. They looked peaceful. The lines on their little faces had softened. For months, he had seen them lying stiff and lifeless. Now they looked alive. He ran a hand over his face and took a step back. "You should stop for tonight," he said quietly. "We'll talk in the morning." Ruth nodded. "Yes, sir." She covered the boys gently with their blankets, her movements slow and full of care. Before leaving, she looked at them one last time and whispered, "Good night, my angels." Mark watched her leave. Her steps were quiet, her shadow stretching across the hallway until it disappeared. The room was still again. The only sound came from the soft ticking of the clock near the window. Mark sat down slowly on the chair beside Ethan's bed. His thoughts were spinning. He had spent so much money on hospitals, special beds, and private doctors. None of them had ever done anything that made a difference. But tonight, a maid, a simple woman with kind eyes, had made his sons move. He leaned forward, touching Noah's small hand. It was warm, not cold like before. He whispered to himself, "What are you doing, Ruth Parker?" He stayed there for a long time. The house was silent, the air heavy with questions he couldn't answer. His late wife, Emily, would have known what to say. She always believed in miracles, but Mark didn't. Not anymore. After she died giving birth to the twins, He had buried his faith with her. He stopped praying, stopped hoping, stopped believing that love could heal anything. All that remained was money and walls. But tonight those walls had cracked. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't stop seeing Ruth's face in his mind, the way she whispered softly as tears rolled down her cheeks. That wasn't just work, that was love. He thought about calling her back, asking more questions, but something told him to wait. Instead, he got up, closed the door, and walked down the hall. His footsteps echoed softly. When he reached his study, he sat behind his large desk, but couldn't focus. The files in front of him looked meaningless. For years, he believed the right doctor could fix anything. But now he wasn't sure anymore. He picked up his phone and almost called the head nurse, but stopped. What would he even say? That his maid was performing a miracle? That his sons moved for the first time in years? No one would believe him. He rubbed his forehead and whispered, "Emily, if you're watching, I need help. I don't understand what's happening." Outside, the rain began again, gentle but steady. The sound filled the silence around him. He turned off the desk lamp and looked through the window. Somewhere in another room, Ruth was probably crying. He had seen it in her eyes, the sadness she tried to hide. Maybe she had her own pain, her own story. But tonight, she had given him something he thought he'd never feel again, hope. He stayed there until morning. The mansion that usually felt like stone now felt alive again, breathing softly with the sound of the rain. When the first light touched the window, Mark made a quiet decision. Tomorrow, he would speak to Ruth Parker. He wanted answers. And deep down, a part of him was afraid of what he might find. The morning sun touched the wide glass windows of the Wilson mansion, painting soft light across the marble floor. The house was quiet, but not empty. Something had changed since the night before. The air felt different, lighter, alive. Mark Wilson sat at the long dining table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. He had barely slept. All night, his mind replayed what he saw in the nursery. Ruth, kneeling beside his sons, their tiny fingers moving, the impossible happening right in front of him. He didn't know what to think. He had built his life on logic, numbers, and rules. But last night, none of those things mattered. What he saw was beyond reason. When he heard footsteps behind him, he looked up. Ruth entered the room quietly, holding a tray of folded towels. Her black and white uniform looked neat as always, her hair tied back, her face calm. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. Mark nodded slowly, his voice low. "Morning, Ruth. Can we talk for a moment?" She stopped beside the table. "Of course, sir." He motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit down." She hesitated for a second, then placed the tray on the counter and sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Mark studied her for a long moment. Her face showed no fear, only patience. She was the kind of woman who had learned to stand calm even when the world looked down on her. "I saw what happened last night," he said finally, "in the nursery." Ruth looked down for a moment, then back up at him. Her eyes were calm. "Yes, sir. You touched them," he said quietly. "You were moving their arms, their legs, and they reacted." "Yes, sir," she said again, her voice steady. Mark leaned forward. "How did you do that?" Ruth's fingers tightened slightly on her lap. "I didn't do anything special, sir. I was only helping them stretch. It helps their muscles feel alive." He frowned. "No, Ruth. You did something. I saw them move. For 2 years, no one has made them move." She stayed quiet, her eyes gentle but unreadable. "Maybe they felt safe," she said after a pause. "Sometimes, that's all a child needs." Mark exhaled sharply. "Safe? You think safety can fix nerves that doctors say are dead." Her voice stayed soft. "I think love can do things medicine sometimes can't." He didn't know how to answer that. He looked at her hands, steady, strong, careful. Not the hands of an ordinary maid. He could see that now. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, finally. Ruth hesitated. For the first time, she looked nervous. "Before I worked here," she said slowly, "I used to help children like them." Mark's eyes narrowed. "You were a nurse?" She shook her head. "Not exactly, sir. I used to work in therapy. Physical therapy." He leaned back in his chair, surprised. "Therapy? You mean medical work?" "Yes, sir." Her voice dropped lower. "I worked in a children's hospital in Dallas for 7 years. I helped children who couldn't move." Mark's heart skipped. "So you're not just a maid." She looked down again. "Not anymore, sir." "What happened?" he asked. Ruth's voice trembled slightly. "It's complicated." "Then make me understand," he said, his tone firm but not cruel. She stayed quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Then she spoke slowly. "Years ago, I worked at a therapy center. It was a good place at first. But then the management started doing wrong things. They took money from parents, promised progress that never came. I tried to speak up." Mark listened closely, his expression hardening. "They didn't like that," Ruth continued. "They said I was lying. They took my license, my job, and my name. After that, no hospital would hire me again." Mark sat back, stunned. The quiet woman sitting across from him wasn't who he thought she was. She had once been a professional, someone who dedicated her life to children like his. "You should have told me this when you came here," he said. "I couldn't," she whispered. "Most people hear a story like that and think you're making excuses. I just needed a chance to work again, even if it meant cleaning floors." Mark looked at her carefully. "So when you touched my sons, you weren't just guessing. You knew what you were doing." She nodded once. "Yes, sir, I did." He rubbed his forehead, trying to process everything. "You shouldn't have done it without asking me first." "I know," she said softly. "I'm sorry. I just couldn't stand seeing them in that state. I see children like them, and I remember the ones I couldn't save before. I wasn't trying to disobey. I was just trying to help." Her voice broke slightly at the end, but she didn't cry. Mark stayed silent. He didn't know what to feel: anger, gratitude, confusion, or guilt. His chest felt heavy. He finally said, "You'll continue working here, but don't touch them again without my permission." Ruth nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." She stood to leave, picking up the tray from the counter. As she turned away, Mark noticed something in her eyes, quiet pain mixed with strength. When she was gone, the room felt colder. Mark sat there for a long time. His coffee was cold, his thoughts restless. He wanted to believe she was telling the truth, but a small voice inside him still doubted. Could it be real? Could a woman like her, with no power, no degree anymore, do what experts couldn't? He stood and walked to the window. The sun outside was bright, but his mind was clouded. Later that afternoon, he called the head nurse and asked how the twins were doing. "They've been calmer than usual today," she said on the phone. "Their muscles feel a little looser. It's strange, sir. Almost like something changed overnight." Mark didn't reply. He just looked toward the hallway where Ruth had walked earlier. That night, when everyone went to bed, he went to the nursery again. The twins were sleeping peacefully. Their little hands were relaxed, not clenched like before. He touched one gently. "Warm, soft." He whispered, "What did you do to them, Ruth?" He didn't know if he was angry or amazed. But he knew one thing. He couldn't stop thinking about her. And tomorrow, he was going to find out everything she was hiding. The next morning came with a quiet rain over Austin. The sky was gray, and the sound of water tapping against the mansion's windows filled the silence. Mark Wilson sat in his study, staring at the laptop in front of him. He hadn't touched his breakfast. His coffee sat cold beside a pile of papers he hadn't read. He had one name typed into the search bar: Ruth Parker. He hesitated before pressing enter. A part of him didn't want to know, afraid that whatever he found might change everything. But curiosity and doubt had already taken over. When the search results appeared, he scrolled slowly. For a few seconds, there was nothing unusual, just common names, random addresses. But then he saw it. Ruth Parker, former pediatric therapist, Dallas Children's Recovery Center. He clicked it. The article opened with a headline that made his stomach tighten. Therapist accused of interfering with management practices, license revoked. He read every line carefully. The report said Ruth had been fired after raising complaints against hospital directors for taking money from families and lying about patient progress. It said she had gone against her supervisors and broken protocol. But nowhere did it say she hurt anyone. At the bottom of the page, one sentence caught his attention. No criminal charges were filed. The case was closed quietly. Mark leaned back, his chest heavy. So she had told the truth. She had tried to do the right thing and lost everything for it. He rubbed his forehead, whispering, "My God, Ruth." He sat there for a while, staring at the screen. His mind replayed her face from the night before, the calm in her eyes, the tears she tried to hide. It made sense now. The care she gave his sons wasn't just duty. It came from someone who had already sacrificed everything for children like them. Later that day, he went to the nursery. The boys were awake, sitting in their chairs by the window. Ruth was there, softly humming as she brushed their hair. Her hands moved with gentle rhythm, her voice low and comforting. When she noticed him at the door, she smiled politely. "Good morning, sir." He nodded slowly. "Morning." The boys turned their heads slightly toward him. It was small, but real. Mark walked closer, looking at them carefully. "How are they today?" "They're calm," Ruth said. "Their muscles feel softer. I've been helping them move a little each day, very slowly." He watched as she placed her hands under Ethan's elbow, helping him stretch his arm. The boy's fingers twitched again, just like before. It wasn't imagination, it was real progress. "You have a gift," Mark said quietly. Ruth's eyes flickered, unsure how to respond. "I only do what I know, sir." "No," he said softly. "You do more than that. You care." She smiled faintly, then looked down. "Caring doesn't pay much, sir, but it's the only thing that keeps me going." Mark looked at her for a long moment. The way she spoke, the way she moved it, reminded him of Emily, his late wife. Emily used to say the same thing, that caring was never a waste, even if no one noticed. He cleared his throat. "Ruth, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sir." "Why did you really leave Dallas?" She stopped brushing Ethan's hair. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. "You looked me up," she said quietly. Mark said nothing. "I thought you would," she added. "People always do when they stop believing what I say." "I just wanted the truth," he said. "The full truth." She turned to face him, her eyes calm but sad. "I told you the truth. I worked at a hospital that cheated families. I tried to stop them. I couldn't prove it, and they took everything from me. I've been cleaning houses ever since." "Why didn't you fight back?" Mark asked softly. "I did," she said. "But when you're poor and they're rich, your voice doesn't matter. I stopped fighting when I realized no one was listening." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't look away. Mark's chest ached. For years, he had lived believing power and money could solve anything. But now, looking at her, he realized what true strength looked like, not control, but quiet endurance. He glanced at his sons again. "And you still help children," he said. "I can't stop," she whispered. "Every time I see a child who can't move, I remember the ones who suffered because I spoke too late." Mark didn't speak. The silence between them was heavy but full of meaning. He looked at the twins again. Their eyes followed Ruth's movement. They trusted her. Even in their condition, they knew she meant safety. "I read the report," he said finally. "It didn't say you did anything wrong." She gave a small, tired smile. "Reports never tell the full story, sir." Mark nodded slowly. "I believe you." The words came out softer than he expected, but he meant them. For the first time, Ruth looked at him with something more than politeness. Her eyes softened, touched with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. He stood there for a moment, watching her gently lift Noah's small hand. "You were born for this, Ruth," he said quietly. "You shouldn't be cleaning floors." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe God put me here for a reason, sir. Maybe your sons were that reason." Those words stayed in his chest long after he left the room. That evening, as rain fell again over the city, Mark sat in his office reading his son's old medical files. Every page said the same thing: permanent paralysis, no chance of speech or mobility. He stared at the words, then at the framed photo of Emily on his desk. She had died believing their sons would never live a normal life. But maybe, somewhere, she had sent Ruth. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The sound of the rain grew louder. For the first time in 2 years, he felt peace. Not because he understood everything, but because he had seen hope, real hope, and it had a name. Ruth Parker. But deep inside, another thought lingered. If the hospital destroyed her once, what would they do if they found out she was healing again? He looked toward the hallway where the nursery was. His sons were sleeping there, safe under her care. He whispered to himself, "If they come for her again, they'll go through me first." He didn't know it yet, but the world was about to find out what Ruth had done, and not everyone would call it a miracle. Days passed quietly inside the Wilson mansion, but nothing felt the same. Every morning, laughter started to return in small ways. The twins no longer stared blankly at the ceiling. Their fingers moved more. Their eyes followed Ruth around the room, and sometimes their lips curved into faint smiles. It was slow, but it was life. Mark Wilson watched them every day, his heart torn between disbelief and wonder. He would stand by the door and listen to Ruth's soft humming as she massaged their little arms and whispered simple words, helping them repeat sounds. The more time passed, the clearer it became. His sons were responding. But soon, what was happening inside the mansion reached beyond its walls. It started when the head nurse, who worked part-time at a nearby clinic, mentioned what she had seen to a friend. "Those twins," she said, "they're moving again. I don't know how, but they are." Within days, whispers began to spread. And then, the past that Ruth had buried came chasing after her. One afternoon, as the rain stopped and the sun returned, Ruth was in the garden hanging fresh sheets. Mark was in his study, reading through some work papers, when his phone rang. It was Dr. Henry Adams, the former hospital director from Dallas. "Mr. Wilson," the voice said coldly, "I hear you've hired one of my old employees, Ruth Parker." Mark froze. "Yes," he said slowly, "she works here." The man's tone grew sharp. "Then I'd advise you to let her go. That woman caused trouble years ago. She's not to be trusted." Mark's jaw tightened. "Trouble? You mean she exposed your lies?" There was silence on the other end, then a quiet laugh. "She ruined her career for a story no one believed. You're a businessman, Mr. Wilson. Don't let pity blind you." Mark's voice dropped low. "My sons are moving because of her. She's done what your doctors couldn't in 2 years. So maybe you're the one I shouldn't trust." He ended the call. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but anger. For the first time in years, he felt protective of someone who wasn't part of his world. Later that evening, he went to the nursery. Ruth was sitting on the floor beside the twins. She looked tired, but peaceful. Noah was lying on a mat, smiling faintly. Ethan's small hand rested on her lap. "They're getting stronger," she said softly. "Look at this." She gently helped Noah lift his hand an inch off the ground. It was shaky, but it was real. Mark knelt beside them, his voice soft. "Dr. Adams called me today." Ruth's body stiffened. "Oh, he told me to fire you," Mark continued. She looked down, her fingers curling tightly together. "I understand, sir. It's happened before." "I didn't say I agreed," he said quietly. Ruth's eyes lifted slowly, uncertain. "You didn't?" "No," he said, "because I believe what I see. And what I see are my sons getting better." Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them back. "They're doing it themselves, sir. I just gave them a little help." He shook his head gently. "No, Ruth. You gave them something no one else did. You gave them love." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The twins watched them quietly, as if they understood the weight of that silence. The next day, everything changed. A local journalist somehow found out about the story. Cameras appeared outside the mansion gate, asking questions about the Maid performing miracles. The staff panicked. Mark's phone didn't stop ringing. Some called it a blessing, others called it fake. Ruth stayed inside, afraid to show her face. She sat in her small room at the end of the hallway, holding her hands together, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. She didn't want fame, she didn't want trouble, she only wanted the boys to heal. That evening, Mark walked into her room. She stood up quickly, nervous. "Sir, I'm sorry about the attention," she said. "I didn't mean for this to happen." He shook his head. "You have nothing to be sorry for. People will talk. Let them. I've spent years caring about what the world thinks, and it gave me nothing." She looked at him, unsure what to say. "I made a promise to Emily," he continued softly. "I told her I'd protect our children. I failed for a long time. But I won't fail again. Not to them, and not to you." Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hide this time. "You don't have to fight for me, sir." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "Because you fought for them when no one else did." The next morning, Mark called a press meeting right at the mansion gates. Cameras clicked as he stood before the reporters. He spoke calmly, his voice steady. "For years, doctors told me my sons would never move or speak," he said. "Then someone walked into our home, a woman no one believed in, a woman the world called a failure. And she gave my children their first movement, their first peace. Her name is Ruth Parker, and she deserves honor, not shame." The story spread everywhere, not as a scandal, but as a miracle. People began calling Ruth the woman with healing hands. Hospitals that once ignored her sent letters asking for her to return. She refused them all. "I belong here," she told Mark quietly one evening, watching the twins play with small toys on the carpet. He smiled faintly. "Yes, you do." Weeks later, the mansion was full of life again. The twins laughed softly each morning. Their tiny voices began forming sounds. Ruth stayed by their side every day, guiding their arms, helping their legs grow stronger. Mark watched from the doorway often, his heart full. The man who once believed only in money now believed in something far greater grace. One afternoon, as the sun poured through the windows, Noah turned toward Ruth and whispered something that made her freeze. "Ma." The sound was weak, broken, but clear. Mark's hand gripped the doorway. Ethan looked at his brother, then copied him. "Ma." Ruth covered her mouth, tears spilling down her face. "Oh, my babies," she whispered. Mark stepped forward, his voice shaking. "They spoke," he said softly. Ruth turned toward him, smiling through tears. "They found their voice, sir." He looked at her, his eyes full of emotion. "No, Ruth, you gave it back to them." The twins reached out their small hands toward her. Ruth knelt and held them close, their laughter mixing with her tears. For the first time in 2 years, the mansion was filled not with silence, but with the sound of life. That night, Mark walked into his study and looked at the picture of Emily. "You were right," he whispered. "Love can still heal what money never could." Outside, the stars shone bright over Texas. Inside the Wilson mansion, 2 small boys slept peacefully beside the woman who gave them back their future. And for the first time, Mark Wilson finally felt that his house had become a home again. Dear viewers, this story reminds us that miracles don't always come from doctors or wealth. Sometimes they come quietly through the heart of someone who chooses to care when the world has stopped believing. Ruth didn't have power, fame, or money, but she had love. And that love gave 2 broken children a second chance to live, and a lonely father a reason to believe again. No matter who you are, or where you come from, your kindness can heal something in someone else. Even the smallest act of love can change a life forever. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs hope today. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from, and what lesson this story taught you. Because one small story of love can remind the world that miracles still happen sometimes, right where we least expect them.